execution park. Come on, my mother urged. Hurry up. Before I change my mind and send you to the crematorium. After the right of parents to kill their children themselves was legalized, there were separate sites for fans of role executions where executions characteristic of this, or that epic or historical event were staged. In particular, the imitation of a concentration camp with a gas chamber and crematorium was a success. There even the workers wore SS uniforms recreated from old photos. Inquisition and Camp Gulag were popular. Later, elementary school teachers and senior kindergarten teachers were equalized in the right of parents. And an execution park was set up outside the city to carry out executions. Kindergartner Marotic knew that the entire first-grade class from their school, which he was to attend in the fall, had been burned alive in the crematorium, and a group from his kindergarten class had been strangled in the gas chamber. The first graders ruined the teacher's chair, and she, after sitting on it, fell and broke something herself. And the kindergartners. Marotic didn't remember. They were shown a movie. How they undressed, how they put her on a stretcher, how they put her in an oven. They showed what was going on in the furnace. How they were beating, how they were flailing in the fire, gradually burning up. Brrr. I'd rather be strangled. Having undressed, Marotic took one more look at his mother, received a smack, and ran to the execution bench. There he was ordered to choose a strangler for himself, a rope with 2 wooden handles. Marotic approached the matter responsibly, as he had been taught in kindergarten. The very short baby strangles were no longer good enough for him, they were too small. And he chose a medium length, thicker and not very prickly. Holding the strangler in his hands, he climbed onto the bench. The bench was long, almost 10 meters, and painted 3 colors: green, yellow, and red. On the green part, undressed children waited their turn, on the yellow part they were beaten with rods, and on the red part they were strangled. Marotic climbed the bench and stood on its green part. In front of him stood a red-haired, curly-haired boy, sobbing and clutching his stranglehold. On the yellow part of the bench, 2 helpers were whipping a second boy, almost bald, with rods. The punished man had his feet and hands clamped in the bars attached to the bench, and was whipped on his bare butt and back. The boy screamed and squealed and jerked his head. And the red part of the bench was being strangled. From his side, Marotic could only see the strangled man dancing, glowing bright red, butt and back, with purple stripes on them. The executed man grasped the performer's hands, wheezed, danced, and tried to kick. At last the wheezing ceased, and the executed man sank and fell silent. His arms sagged along his body, his legs snapped, and he hung on the rope. The executors lifted the body of the child by the strangler around his neck, and carried him to the burning. They burned him in a barrel, over an open fire. The blue flame of the gas burner danced over the edge of the barrel. The executed man was placed in the barrel. His whole torso was in the fire, and only his knee-high legs were left outside, sticking upwards. While Marotic watched the burning, the red-headed boy was placed on the bench, and his hands and feet were clamped together. And the one who had just been flogged was placed on the red part, a strangler was put on, and the execution began. Soon it was Marotic's turn. The redhead was taken to strangle him, and Marotic lay down on the yellow bench, and put his hands through the holes in the stalks. His hands and feet were squeezed, and he could not move. A second later the bars whistled. Marotic yelled at once, for he could not stand it in any way. It was written in the books that they stifled and strangled him for exactly 3 minutes. Marat did not know how long he had been strangled. At the end Marotic was squealing, and of course he had lost all will to resist. What was there to resist, when he was beaten so badly? Here he was released, lifted up by his hair, and almost ran over to the red part of the bench, dragged by a strong hand by his hair. Immediately they put the strangler he himself had brought around his neck. Arzap, Marotic wheezed and rushed to intercept the strangler, but his arms were firmly grasped. The strangler bit into his skin, squeezed his throat until he had tears in his eyes. The baby jumped just like the others in front of him, The strangling was done in 3 moves. 1 minute of choking, then they loosened the choke a little, then they choked again, loosened it again, and choked for good. When they loosened the stranglehold, Muradov coughed and roared. When they strangled him, he wheezed and danced. Then he flew over the bench, crying and stamping his feet. At last the strangler was tightened with all its might. Muradov died silently, kicking his legs. Soon his head went fuzzy, his eyes went all dark, and the baby hung on the rope. Without checking whether the child was dead or alive, they carried Muradov into the fire. 7-year-old Artemka looked at the choking bench with fear. His older brother, 11-year-old Dima, brought him to the park. He brought him by order of his parents, who remained waiting in the car. Dima also stayed clothed, and on his wrist I saw a keychain, by the presence of which you could tell that Dima was a guest, and not a hooligan, who could be executed by anyone who wanted to. Artemka's own clothes were thrown into the general pile, and the child was completely naked. Dima, in general, loved executions, and if the neighbors let him run over their kid himself, he was even happy. Dima did not like lines. And there was one in front of the bench. Muradov just started dancing there. Artyomka couldn't choose his choke. He would take one, put it back, take another. What do you have against this one? Dima shrugged and was distracted by Muradov suddenly stamping his feet. What a jerk. Let's have another one, eh? Artyomka begged. It seemed to him that the strangling is very painful, and he will suffer. What kind of what? Mocked Dima. You dropped the TV, and now you're whining? Muradov had been jumping for a long time, and Dima was finally tired of it. Grabbing Artemka by the arm, he dragged him away. Come on, let's go. Why are you so whiny? Kostya was grilled yesterday, and you didn't ask. Kostya was grilled by Daddy himself, for the same broken TV. But he was only 2.5 years old. And it's a pain in the ass to grill a boar like that. Where are we going? Artyomka asked, without any excitement. Let's go to the chop shop. He suggested the guillotine. There was almost no queue, and the execution was quick. Snip, no head. After some thought, Dima agreed to take Artyomka to the beheading. Fortunately, it was not excruciating, and he himself had already stood next to him once when his classmate's head was cut off. The beheading machine had been converted from a manual metal guillotine that had once stood in the high school locksmith shop. It was just a large-sized shear set on 4 legs. The lower part is stationary, the upper part is movable, with a lever. At the bottom are 2 short, metal rods welded in. These are neck restraints. To prevent the executioner from slipping out from under the knives, he has to put his neck between these rods. Then the execution will go smoothly. But as the boys approached the cutthroat, they were beaten to it. 10 naked boys, about 12 years old, and 2 girls, in bathing suits. There was 1 adult with them. A teacher, apparently. The boys took turns approaching the headshaker, leaning over and placing their heads on the bottom between the rods. The boys either rested their hands on their knees or put them behind their backs. 2 girls took hold of a lever once, and the head fell to the floor. The steamed meat also fell there. Artyomka watched carefully as the big boys were executed. Many of them were jerking their legs amusingly without their heads. But it wasn't very scary. It took the girls a little over a minute for the boys. When the boys' heads were being cut off, they didn't move the cutter, even though it was on wheels. The boys' bodies were falling one on top of the other, forming a real pile. The last boys had to rest their knees on those already executed. But as soon as the last boy was beheaded, the teacher ordered the girls to undress themselves, taking away their bracelets. The girls hesitated, but obediently undressed. When they were done with them, Dima politely asked if the guillotine was free. He answered in the affirmative and told Artyomka to lie down under the knife, and Artyomka obediently climbed onto the pile of still warm bodies. He lay down next to the last of the executed girls, stuck his head between the prongs, and squeezed his eyes shut to avoid looking at the severed heads still moving their lips. Dima waited until Ardyanka had settled down and finished fiddling, and he pressed his whole body against the handle. His brother didn't even squeak, he only kicked his feet. It was easy to cut off the head with the guillotine. I didn't even have to hold Theo. Dima playfully slapped his decapitated body on the butt, picked up his brother's severed head, and wandered back to the entrance.